Hey folks, nothing's given me more pleasure since being at Penn than being invited to welcome you all today to this roundtable to celebrate Amy Kaplan's new book, Our American Israel. Because we're going to be focused on the book for the next hour or so, I just wanted to say one thing for us to hold this book in mind, because it's part of a much longer set of works, right, that to me follow logically, starting with her first construction of American realism, but then also the book she did with Pease on cultures of U.S. imperialism, which I wrestled with profoundly when I was writing one of my own books, and then The Anarchy of Empire with that beautiful last chapter on Du Bois and Darkwater, which I also ended up wrestling with in writing another book. So this book makes perfect sense to me. It's a beautiful text. Our colleagues are going to talk about it, but I would say what we have here is a national treasure, or maybe a transnational treasure would be the better way to think about it. And we have this abundance of riches here today in talking about this book. I think this is also the one time I could step up and say this is a panel that needs no introduction. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia, and he's distinguished from all these others in one way only, which is that he actually appears in the book next to Tom Friedman, no less, in 1982 in Beirut. So there's Ian Lustig, who's the Bess Hyman Chair in Political Science here at Penn, Melanie McAllister, a Professor of American Studies and International Affairs at George Washington University, Shira Robinson, an Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at GW, Joan Scott is Professor Emerita in the School of Social Science at the Institute of Advanced Study, and she wants me to emphasize that's not Princeton University. And Rebecca Stein is the Nicholas J. and Teresa M. Leonardi Associate Professor in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke. They'll each give us about 5 to 7 minutes of commentary, and then we'll open it up. Amy might respond or not. We'll see. I'm Bob Vitalis. I teach political science. Thank you. So, in alphabetical order, I believe that's Rashid.
Should we do it from here or from there?
From there is fine.
From here's good? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, well, in one way, I want to thank Jed and everybody who put this together. I want to thank Amy for giving us the book that's the occasion for this. This is an absolutely wonderful book. It's the book I have wished for much of my life, having grown up in New York City. I knew something was wrong with what I was hearing, and I have understood that in a part of my brain ever since then. But since I finally read the book in draft and then the final version, I understood why what I was hearing was all wrong. It's very hard to take only 5 minutes. They've given us 5 to 7 minutes each.
You can have 2 of mine.
Thank you, Joan. I may take them. On a subject that's as vast as the United States and Israel, or on a book that's as rich as this one. It's a testament to this book and to Amy Kaplan that so many of us wanted to be here. There are lots of books about the United States and the Middle East. I've written a couple of them myself. There are too many books to count on Israel, and a very large number on Israel and the United States. But there are so few books on the relationship, on that unique relationship between this country and Israel, that do more than just repeat mindless platitudes that pass for political discourse in the United States. Shared values, unbreakable bonds, only democracy in the Middle East. I could go on, and every word I say would be familiar to every single one of you. What this book does, as anybody who's looked at it suddenly realizes, is that it drills down to something much more important than the politics. It drills down to the cultural bedrock of each of these platitudes, which is a service in itself. But it's actually much more than that. My favorite part of this book is that chapter on Exodus. And I know a couple of us are going to be talking about that, but I couldn't resist talking about it myself. The book and the movie. I learned, lecturing around this country over several decades, that much of what most people think they know about much that has to do with Palestine and Israel comes from that awful movie and that appalling book. I always knew that. it provides the founding narrative, in fact. And this wonderful book, Amy's wonderful book, has proven this without a doubt. Other people have said it, but she's shown it in the most, I think, in the deepest and most profoundest way, showing that this book has taken on the status of Virgil's Aeneid. That's her comparison, not mine. Now, I always hated both of those works for entirely different reasons. The glorification of mindless militarism, the glorification of terrorization of civilians, actually, in those respects, they're the same. But in the case of the Aeneid, obviously, the glorification of imperial grandeur. I always found nauseating, and I hated it when I had to read it. I had to read it two different stages in my education. And I obviously loathed Exodus for other reasons. What she points out, though, I mean, she does this brilliant analysis of the book, but what she points out is that this is not a foundational fiction by Israelis for Israelis. It's a foundational fiction by Americans for Americans. And that's why it's such an important book. It grounds the myth of origin of Israel and the myth of origin of the United States, and grounds both of them in Exodus, i.e. in the Bible. I mean, it's a tour de force, and linking two colonial settler societies in the same way. A tour de force. I read that chapter again on the train, and I was just, for the fifth time, I think, I was just blown away. Another chapter I want to mention briefly, which is the chapter entitled Invincible Victims. You can't beat that description for Israel. Invincible victims, eternal victims, always victorious, never lost a war. It's perfect. I mean, it's just, I wish I'd come up with it. You beat me to the punch. And as brilliant as the exposition of Exodus is the way in which she shows how 1967 becomes the other foundational element for, again, a second generation's understanding of and attachment to Israel. So she's done something with the Holocaust, she's done something with Exodus and 48, and she's done something with 67. Actually, nobody has ever done, explaining this extraordinary link between these two peoples and these two countries, because it's not a political link. What she's showing is it's deeper, much deeper than a political link. Another of my favorite people, Peter Novick, had touched on some of these things in his book, The Holocaust in American Life, which she cites amply in the Holocaust chapter. And Amy goes much further, I think, and is much more profound in showing how the Holocaust is linked to American understandings of Israel, but also how 67 reimagined and revitalized the idea of the possibility of the extermination of Israel. We now know, anybody who's looked at any archives knows, that all Israeli and all American military and intelligence personnel knew perfectly well that the defeat, let alone the extinction of Israel, was absolutely impossible in 1967. But what she shows is how 67 reinforced this invincible victim paradigm. I'll just say one or two other things. Another chapter that I loved, I truly loved, was the chapter on the 1982 war. And I mean, I was in Beirut in 1982, and I dealt with the journalists some of the journalists that she refers to in this book, and she has it so absolutely right. The sea change in the way Israel is viewed as a result of 82, and then equally important, the pushback that she describes is absolutely what you need to understand what's going on now and what has gone on since 82. Something fundamental changed in 82, and then it changed back, or at least partially changed, as she shows brilliantly in that chapter. And it's been happening again and again and again. There are many other aspects of this book that are, in my view, truly brilliant. It's indispensable for understanding how Israel has developed a unique connection to its American metropole, what has been since the 40s, its American metropole, drawing the mythologies of these two settler colonial societies together in a way that's far, far, far stronger and far deeper than the connections between almost any two states on Earth. All of us, I think, know much more about something we previously thought we understood, and we owe that eternally to Amy Kaplan's book. Thanks.
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Ian Lustig. I'm the Bess W. Heyman Professor of Political Science here at Penn. Amy and I have talked about the book projects we've been working on over time. I know I've benefited tremendously from her, so I feel connected to this book in a number of ways. Just to lay out for those of you who might not understand it, what the book tries to do and what it in fact does. She shows how myths and tropes that are commonly associated with settler colonial societies, or what political science is sometimes called fragment societies, pieces of Europe that spun off and landed in the third world. She shows how those myths and tropes are so salient in the political culture of both Israel and the United States. There's a congruence that's constantly explored in this book. It created a myriad of fabulous opportunities for Americans and cultural entrepreneurs to find ways that Americans could positively identify with Israel and admire Israel. As Rashid said, as it's wonderful, as an invincible but permanent victim. Exceptional, chosen for both glory and redemption, things that Americans like to think of themselves as skilled and heroic Indian fighters, if not Indian killers, now come to life as expert counterterrorists, which Amy goes into quite a bit of detail on, as always unfairly pilloried, and partly because they are envied, again, a basis for American identification, as technically and economically skilled, and therefore as needing to protect itself, Israel and America, from the hordes who would love to come there. Now, this whole depiction of this overlap and of these opportunities for identification are made all the more powerful by the Christian ethos of America, which makes the Holocaust Israel narrative, the story of death and redemption, if not resurrection, nearly irresistible for American audiences. So the book makes, in my view, a direct, if unasserted, contribution to the debate over how to explain the special relationship between the United States and Israel. That special relationship, actually a kind of unique, kind of unprecedented relationship in the annals of international relations. She does it not by showing that politicians and policymakers are themselves animated by these identifications, but by highlighting the ocean of popular culture within which our politicians and policymakers swim, which is overwhelmingly oriented to treat Israel as deserving, right, and as persecuted. There's an implicit message that distortions, in the book, that distortions with these cultural tropes and identifications, that these distort American policy toward the Middle East, which is a version of the classic argument that when it comes to Israel, the United States does not follow its national interests. We're all familiar with that argument from Mearsheimer and Walt, but also from George Ball and many others. Now, whether there is such a thing as the national interest, and whether U.S. foreign policy is ever guided by it, are questions for another day, but consider that the relationship, and this is my main point on it, the relationship is not one way. If I can just, no, it's okay. The title we all look at is Our American Israel, but the subtitle is the story of an entangled alliance. And in fact, what I'd like to highlight in my brief remarks is the way that what Amy has documented affects Israel, not how it affects the United States. The United States, its view, its behavior, its actions on Israel and the Middle East can be seen as 4 standard deviations from the international mean, completely in another universe when it comes to this issue. We have talked about what that does to the United States. What does that do to Israel when the most powerful country in the world stands so far from the international mean? Israel has been affected, and I would say much more drastically than the United States has, by the phenomenon that Amy is documenting. Because of the immense amounts of unconditional military, political, and economic American support that have flowed to Israel and that are expected and believed will continue to flow, a cocoon of protection and false security has surrounded Israeli democracy, concealing from Israeli voters the long-term costs of their intransigent and maximalist policies that are politically convenient and emotionally satisfying in the short run because of this cocoon. How is it otherwise that Israel produces increasingly maximalist far-right governments? How is it that the country has changed so much that it is virtually impossible for almost any observer to figure out how a moderate or left-of-center government could emerge in that country? How is it that Benjamin Netanyahu is soon to become the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, beating out even David Ben-Gurion? How does that happen? A crucial part of the answer to those questions is that the Israel lobby, protected and enabled by the cultural circumstances and dynamics that Amy analyzes, has ensured American policies that have systematically destroyed the careers, hopes, and plans of hundreds of moderate Israeli politicians by undermining and proving false their warnings that we have to take world opinion and American opinion into consideration and take a look at the long run and if we're going to survive. American policy has made it clear that all of those politicians have been wrong. And that has helped to shove the Israeli political trajectory into a part of the space of all possible ways Israel could have developed into a very narrow maximalist zone where it is currently trapped. Now, there is a hopeful aspect to the book in this context, and that is that its exploration of those minor but real occasions where Amy shows in the relationship when negatively valenced American beliefs are attached to Israel. This happened during the Lebanon War, when Israel is seen as an occupier, well, we Americans aren't occupiers, or as aggressive, we are not aggressive, or as racist, we are not racist. Now, Amy's analysis therefore opens the question of the implications for Israel of the deep polarization of American society, including polarization over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which she does mention in regard to changes in the Democratic and Republican parties. By Amy's analysis, the effects of these trends can be powerful, even if they are also likely to be concealed for some time by the superfunded and well-organized but strictly political dominance of the Israel lobby. Thank you.
Next up is Melanie McAllister, American Studies.
Thank you, Bob. I'm very happy to be here. Hi, Amy. I thought I would focus a little bit on the cultural analysis in the book because that's one of the things that I do, and I've learned so much from doing it. And I'll come to that in a minute. But I also want to say before we start that Amy and I kind of birthed these babies at the same time. I had a book that just came out. This book just came out, and we read things for each other over the course of the last couple of years. And one of the things we maybe don't often talk enough about is how much it means to have colleagues who take time out of their lives to read for you, to hold your hand, to help think through issues. And that I'm so happy to see this book, but I'm also so grateful for all the time that you took out of this book to help me with my book. So thank you. One of the things that the book does is set itself this expansive and difficult task, which Amy states very simply in the intro when she says, "This book aims to recover the strangeness of an affinity that has come to be seen as self-evident." So recovering strangeness is the task of the book in many ways, and reading culture is one of the most important methods by which she does that, arguing throughout that culture helps to construct narratives that become almost invisible in their naturalization. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about three of the moments when she does that. One is the Exodus chapter. I'll talk a little bit less about that than I might have because I know it's one that lots of people want to talk about. But I'll mention that I wrote about Exodus in my first book, and yet reading this, I learned something on every page. I mean, it was just a revelation, really. And one of the things that Amy does is she does something more than just read the book and the film as part of a network of narratives and affective stances, although she does do that. But she also looks at aspects of the ways in which the book and the film were created, how they became cultural events, and also how they misrepresent in productive ways. So it's easy to show sometimes like, oh, this is how it really happened and this is how the book or the film got it wrong. and that's always interesting. But what Amy does is show how those misrepresentations produce a common sense about Israel and its founding. So, for example, she talks about the reality of what happened on the original ship, which is the SS Exodus, which is sailing to Palestine to protest a British policy about Jewish immigration to Palestine. And first, she does show that there are real inaccuracies in the novel's retelling, but this is Leon Uris, so we are not shocked by this fact, right? But what she also shows is what the impact of certain choices and inaccuracies was. So, for example, one that's most striking to me is that the SS Exodus included Americans in its crew, and as part of the sort of the idea for the ship altogether. And Amy points out, you might have thought that Uris, writing this book for Americans, puts Americans in the story, like that's easy, let's make that connection, but that he doesn't do that. He makes Americans completely invisible in the story of the Exodus ship. So why? And so what Amy concludes, and I think quite brilliantly, is this. Excluding American Jews from Israel's founding epic had the canny effect of presenting its origins as a universal struggle for freedom and not as the special interest of a particular ethnic group. By kicking American Jews off the Exodus, Uris made his Zionist characters appeal both more and less familiar, less like stereotypical Jews and more like archetypal Americans. So it's that level of nuance that I found over and over again in the piece, and found it in things that seemed familiar, and yet I found her readings often really surprising to me. So I'll just mention two other examples of that. Amy has a chapter on Christian Zionist narratives about Israel, which is something that I've also done some writing and thinking about. And some of the material was stuff that we are all kind of painfully familiar with at this point, right? So we've seen those folks talk about Israel and Muslims and the end of times and prophecy in the wake of 9/11 and in many other instances before and after. But Amy does these readings of it that really show kind of, again, the layers and nuances of things that are going on. And she also wrote about someone that I actually didn't know, but I love, and this is a place where gender analysis comes beautifully to the fore in the kind of subtle ways that it often does in the book. She talks about a guy named Pastor Stu Weber, who wrote the kind of book that evangelicals often write, called Tender Warrior, God's Intention for a Man. And yeah, so in it, Weber is talking about how he comes to understand the importance of Israel to evangelical Christianity. And he says, and this is Amy's reading of it, Weber's describing his first visit to Israel in 1974 radically changed his portrait, this portrait he had of Jews, when he met an Israeli diver, David, who inspired his vision of a muscular Christ. And then I'm quoting from Weber, a Jewish male in his prime, David was a native-born Sabra, and then he explains, recovering from wounds received in the Yom Kippur War, with dark skin, black hair, and piercing dark eyes. He had piercing dark eyes, hard as black steel, and it goes on. But that image of using Israelis to do a certain kind of work for Americans around masculinity, around affiliation, and around this kind of philo-Semitism that can be quite as disturbing as more direct anti-Semitism. Okay, and I'll end quickly as my time is up, but I just want to say that she also did something that people don't get enough credit for, which is that she watched all of Homeland. Did I say something? She watched all of Homeland, and she watched entire seasons of NCIS. And
So we didn't have to?
yes, so we don't have to.
Yes.
And
Public service.
and the readings of those are very nice and again nuanced in ways. I mean, it's easy to hate Homeland. I like hating Homeland. It's a thing that I can count on. If I want to get my rage going, I either turn on Twitter or I watch Homeland. But she reads the CIA agent Carrie Matheson as in her way in the first season where she's watching the guy that she suspects of being an American terrorist who's converted to Islam, and she discovers that indeed he is a terrorist, but she also, of course, in the way things work, falls in love with him as a result of watching him so closely. But then, this is how Amy describes it, and I'll just end with this. Homeland reveals that the terror at the heart of Homeland Security is not about the foreigner next door or the imam at the local mosque, but about the American war hero you elect for public office, the lover in your bed, or the suburban dad in his garage workshop. The idea that everything truly American could turn into its opposite and implode. So I'll just end with that and say that I think we're very lucky to have this book, which offers us such subtle and nuanced insights into the way that culture has worked in helping shape our understandings of Israel.
Shira Robinson.
Okay, well, my name is Shira Robinson. I'm honored to be here coming from DC, coming from GW, and I'm honored to be here both with Amy and with this group of critical scholars that Amy and Jed have brought together. I was speaking with Melanie at the train station, and she confirmed that this may possibly be the very first book that brings together, in terms of the history of the sort of cultural history of the American-Israeli relationship, both the Jewish and the evangelical sides of the story, both at a cultural level and an institutional level, and one that documents the fraught relationship between those two parties, particularly over such a long chronological sweep. So I'm a historian's historian, so I think of chronological bookends and things like that. So that, I just want to sort of put a shout out to the book and to Amy for sort of covering such a wide swath of material and issues and over such a long period of time. There's a lot to take away from this book, and for me, I just wanted to point out a few things that I got out of it as a social historian of Israel-Palestine per se, rather than as a scholar of U.S. cultural history. One was this really well-documented, fascinating shift that she tracks over the past 70-plus years or so from the Americanization of Israel to what she calls the Israelization of America. Another thing that I found really fascinating, just sort of speaking to this question of settler colonial genealogies that my predecessors have also invoked, Amy invokes or sort of discusses and gets at this kind of toxic combination of a kind of liberal civilizing mission that both uplifts Arabs and whitens Jews in Palestine alongside an anti-Semitism at home in the U.S. that was so critical, that combination was so critical to the widespread support that Zionism received in the United States before 1948 and that Israel received thereafter from within American society. And that toxic combination was very potent to me as I was reading it. I love the use, another thing that really struck out to me was the way that Amy used Leon Uris's archives, his personal letters to his father, to kind of get at his inner thinking and his inspiration for what he wanted to write in the novel, the Exodus book, which became the basis for the film. Another thing which really struck me was the ways in which, and this is also something that other people have talked about already, but the ways in which mainstream politicians and cultural producers or entrepreneurs in the U.S. disavowed over and over again, since 1945, the settler colonial dynamic and violent dispossession that Jewish state building required in Palestine, and which was staring at them in the face, lest they be forced to reckon with America's own settler colonial legacy at home. Another thing that I learned from the book that I can't believe I didn't know this, things that seem so self-evident, which shouldn't be, is that the Holocaust Museum, I'm from Washington, D.C. originally, and I didn't know that the Holocaust Museum that its founding was rooted in U.S. Jewish and Zionist opposition to Camp David. Who knew? I didn't know that. And the opposition for a potential resolution on the refugee issue. And this is not, I just wanted to sort of stop for a second and say, this is not an obscure factoid, this relationship between the Holocaust Museum and opposition to Camp David, that we can sort of bring up at dinner parties and say, oh, look at how smart I am. This is actually very much salient today. So I was telling, the other day, I was telling Rebecca, my colleague here to my right, that I have this brilliant student at GW, probably my smartest student ever. She's not Jewish, but she became very, very interested from her freshman year. I met her in her junior year in Holocaust studies, and she went to Warsaw, Poland for a summer to do an internship at a Holocaust museum before Poland switched politics around the Holocaust this past year. And then she spent this following summer in Cambodia. She took both my classes on the Middle East and Israel-Palestine, respectively, and she became very enamored she became very interested in the Palestine question of Palestine. So, but she works at the Holocaust Museum as an intern, and she's graduating, and she wants to get a job next year for a year to be a full-time staff member there. She became very interested in the question of Palestine, so she writes me an email in the fall. It says, Shira, or Professor Robinson, it occurs to me that there could be a conflict of interest if I'm trying to get a job at the Holocaust Museum next year, if I want to intern at this Palestinian think tank in D.C. Do you think that would be a problem? And I thought, really? Could there be a problem? I said, no, it'll be fine, but if you're concerned, just go to whoever your contacts are. Who do you trust at the museum, and it'll be fine. So she went to her mentor at GW, her sort of longstanding mentor, who was on the board of the Holocaust Museum, and he said, absolutely no way. You cannot have this on your CV. And this is a think tank that brings scholars like all of the people at this table to talk about our books and about the state of affairs. So this is not the past, this is the present. Another thing that I really appreciated about Amy's book is the careful and sort of systematic chronicling that she does of the exchanges between American and Israeli law enforcement agencies since the aftermath of 9/11. And some of you in the room may be familiar with the Jewish Voice for Peace's ongoing campaign, which they're calling Deadly Exchange, in which they're trying to monitor and track these exchanges. And that promotional campaign and consciousness-raising campaign got off to a very contentious start. I think it was last year or 2 years ago, in part because the promotional video that they created failed to provide a lot of evidence. So if you don't have your contacts in JVP, they should be coming after you or after your book to sort of figure out all the things they didn't know. So I just wanted to mention that. And I just want to end with a question. For everyone in the room and for my colleagues here, I personally have been really struck since 2016, over the last 2 years, by the ways in which, and I could be wrong about this, so you can push back, about the ways in which I think the liberal Zionist bottom in this country seems to be falling out. Between the Trump campaign's trafficking and anti-Semitic tropes at the end of the campaign against Clinton, to Richard Spencer's proud self-embrace as a white Zionist, to Bibi's bear hugs with former Nazi allies and contemporary Holocaust deniers in Europe, to the ferocious nationalist chauvinism that the Israeli government and its allies in the U.S. have unleashed to fight Palestinian and Jewish anti-racist, anti-occupation opposition inside Israel and here in this country. It seems that between all of these things, all signs are indicating that it is becoming increasingly impossible for liberal Zionists in this country to walk the already slippery tightrope that they have precariously walked along for the last 7 decades. In other words, supporting civil rights and progressive politics at home while lending their support to Jewish privilege in Israel. I think that Amy's book offers a way to historicize this collapse of American liberal Zionism under the weight of its own contradictions. But since as a historian, it's above my pay grade to predict the future, I wonder what the way forward is. Do evangelicals and the hard Israeli right fill that vacuum? What role do Palestinians and Palestinian Americans play in this story, along with, their potential Jewish allies here and there? So I just thought if we have time at the end, we could hash that out. Thank you.
I'm Joan Scott. I'm a professor emerita at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. What I wanted to talk about, thank you, Jed, for doing this. Thank you, Amy, for the book. What I wanted to talk about was my experience watching this book take shape when Amy came to the Institute with the project in mind. But I was trying to think, is this the conception? Is this the birth? What is this? And I finally thought take shape is the only way I could really describe it. But what was so interesting to me in that year she spent working on it, and was personally very important for me, was the friendship she and I developed. I had never met her before. The friendship she and I developed around political, intellectual, and personal things. It became an extremely valuable thing for me to hear what was going on, to hear how she was approaching this topic. And the conversations we had both about how you do history, how you write argumentative chapters with all of that historical material in it, were as useful and important for me as I think they probably were for Amy. The first thing she did at the Institute was the Exodus talk. I mean, we're all talking about Exodus. And I have to say, I don't know if you remember maybe, but, Amy, but much of the distress of certain people in the audience, she unveiled this myth and took it apart. There were people sitting there shaking their heads for whom that story was the story, and was it what had brought them either into adulthood as admirers of Israel, or as adults confirmed what it was they actually knew. I thought it was a brave talk, given the composition of some of that audience, but also really brilliant in the way it took apart, irresistibly took apart how that story worked, how that film, she had clips from the film, we saw the handsome, whatever, what's his name?
Paul Newman.
Ari
Ben
Ari Ben
Ari,
Kenan.
the Paul Newman, the most improbable Jew you could possibly imagine. And she showed this and sort of analyzed it in a way that I think the whole book does. It takes apart these myths that have sustained a certain Zionist vision of American-Israeli relations, and irrefutably leaves you with the conclusion that you had bought into a myth that really wasn't exactly as things were. One of the things that was most exciting to me was to see how excited Amy was in what we'll call the archives. I mean, they were sometimes real archives from a historian's point of view. They were old pieces of paper, sometimes they were letters or texts that she was using. And she would come into my office or come to lunch and say, I can't believe this. The nation was in favor of Israel. Frieda Kirchway, and she'd read me these, I.F. Stone, and that was the one that killed me. Because I.F. Stone was the hero in my family growing up, my anti-Zionist family. And I.F. Stone was the guy we all turned to during the Vietnam War for kind of an intelligent politics that fed everything else we did. And here was I.F. Stone cheering on the project in the 40s. The amazing thing about what she did, of course, was she didn't dismiss I.F. Stone forever, as I was probably almost ready to do, and she read me these quotes and told me these stories. But instead, and I wanted to read the concluding paragraph that she comes to when she's talking about Stone, which suggests not only her own facility at thinking these things, but the kind of subtle reading and understanding of how history works. That is, people do change over time. Contexts matter. Political situations matter in the positions and even in the principal positions that people are willing to take. Stone's views of Israel went through many changes in those 30 years. I thought when I read that, at the time of his trip to Palestine, his attachment to binationalism did not quench his enthusiasm for the Zionist project. A firmer commitment to a just solution for two peoples would emerge more strongly after 1967, and these are the crucial years. But in 1948, neither he nor his fellow liberals predicted that the UN vote to partition Palestine would create a violent and irreparable rupture. They had imbued a nationalist movement with the moral urgency of a humanitarian mission, and they imagined that a Jewish state, whether alone or in federation with an Arab state in Palestine, would benefit and not dominate the Arabs living there. And the final paragraph really, to me, final sentence sums up the book. These liberal narratives blinded them to the violent dispossession that created a new refugee crisis and would lead to the revival of the Palestinian nationalist movement. Even in that one paragraph, that kind of synthetic summary of the history of this particular guy and the reading of it out to the larger set of issues is symptomatic, or is typical, I think, of the way the book works. So finally, it was in our discussions about the writing of this that I gained enormous insight into the perfectionism that drives Amy. There were chapters that I read that sometimes I thought needed work, and I said so, and she would rework them. But there were chapters I thought needed no work at all, and she was not satisfied. And she'd say, well, I'm going to do this and rearrange that, and send back a chapter that was, in fact, probably better than the one that I thought was fine. But I think the combination of wonderful intelligence, a historical sensibility that uses cultural analysis but also historical analysis, and to create a kind of irrefutable argument. And the review that you sent us from the forwards, I think, of this guy not on the side, that this book is on the side of, saying there were irrefutable arguments here that absolutely had to be contended with if people were going to understand this relationship and have a position, a political position different from the one that they did. So thank you, Amy, for this.
Rebecca Stein.
It's really great to be here, with apologies for my cold. Apologies to
Mine
those
too.
around me. But I'm really, really pleased to be able to be here to celebrate this work. And while it's an incredibly sobering book, I would say it's also a pleasure to read, and it's a kind of a funny combination, as I think you've heard from other folks here. And part of the pleasure, as you've heard today, comes in the encounter with its quite astounding and sometimes bizarre cultural archive. And in preparing for this talk, I had the occasion to be going through YouTube to try to find Pat Boone's 1972 musical tribute to Israel, which is quite an astounding document. So there's all these astounding cultural forms that one encounters here. So I come to this book as a cultural anthropologist, interested in the politics of popular culture in Israel. You're going to hear some recurrent themes here. And my own work has been interested in the ways that Israeli militarism is authorized and normalized in popular cultural spaces. So this is what I'll be thinking about today, as others have as well, how this particular cultural archive has been crucial to the production and normalization of this special relationship, crucial to installing the American-Israel alliance as a matter of what she calls common sense, or rather, and I think this is the key point, what feels like common sense. And it's feeling, what I'm really thinking about as I give these comments, and I can't reflect on too much of this today, is this notion of feeling. And what one might think about Raymond Williams on structures of feeling, the Israel-American alliance has the form of a structure of feeling. The Zionism in Israel has the form of a structure of feeling, and it routes through popular culture, and why? This is the question that I've been thinking about, which I'll just address briefly. So what's in the archive? And I wanted to give you a little bit more of a sense of what's in the archive. Back to Exodus we go. It's incredible. I've been watching Exodus. I'm only 2 hours in. It's 3 hours and 25 minutes. It's spectacular, and I recommend it to you. So we've got Leon Uris's 1959 bestseller by that name, which was a blockbuster book, and then the Hollywood film would follow in 1960. And what's crucial is that Paul Newman is the leading man here. And as we've heard, the history of Israel's founding is retold, right, in this Hollywood idiom and as a Western. Quite amazing genre collapse here, producing a recapitulation of American frontier myths. Now, it will not surprise you to learn that Arabs are all but banished as subjects from both text and film, and this banishing paves the way for the British to be installed as the true antagonists of the Zionists, and therein for Jewish settlers to figure as the colonized subjects rising up against foreign rule. So it's this refiguration that's crucial in the ways that, for American audiences, Exodus functions as a powerful allegory of the American revolutionary context. Paul Newman. You must see Paul Newman playing the role of this improbable Jew, as Joan Scott has said, with his radiant whiteness and hyper-American masculinity, and he fails to persuade us, right, that he is in fact this Sabra, but this is precisely the point, and I think we learned this from Amy. This failure to persuade is precisely the point. It's the insistent Americanness of Exodus that gave it its cultural power. It's its insistent hybridity. Paul Newman can never be the Sabra. And we know this. There's a kind of uncanniness to Paul Newman which makes the film work the way it does, which works to forge a popular American identification with Israel that would last for decades. So what else is in this cultural archive? Pardon me. In Amy's account of the rise of Christian Zionism, we learn about Pat Boone's 1972 musical, not on YouTube again, the Pat Boone family in the Holy Land, and we learn about his lifelong involvement with Israel, which Amy calls a potent mix of popular culture, masculine militarism, and belief in biblical prophecy. We also learn about the 1970s book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which linked global political change to biblical prophecy and helped forge a bond between American evangelicals and the modern state of Israel. We also learned that Pat Boone's archive, some of it is actually housed in Yad Vashem, right? And that's so stunning. I wanted to put the book down right there. So, but we learn about the rationale for that kind of an archival history in this book. So all of these texts circulated at remarkable scales, and this is, of course, at the core of their cultural power. Although issued by a small Christian publishing house, The Late Great Planet Earth would sell an astounding 10 million copies in that decade alone. The film version would star Orson Welles, of course, as narrator, and again, please spend some time on YouTube with this document. The 1990s would see the birth of the popular Left Behind book series, with an equally astonishing circulatory reach well beyond the community of evangelical Christian Zionists. And we have other chapters on Spielberg's Schindler's List, Munich, we've heard Homeland, and a zombie apocalypse film from 2013, well worth the read in the last chapter. So my bigger question is, what's the bigger story of this cultural archive? What is it that popular culture is doing here, right? And again, I'm thinking about structures of feeling. That popular culture has been vital in forging the Israel-American relationship as a matter of common sense, or rather what feels like common sense, I think is the point here. Through this cultural domain and texts with this kind of incredibly broad audience and appeal, politics migrates from the space of dispassionate affairs of state to make a claim on the imaginations of publics, on hearts and not merely on minds. In Hollywood's rendering of Israel and the Zionist dream, we see the forging of an effective relationship to Israel, through heroes and villains, through masculine militarism, through romance and virility. When rendered in Technicolor with Paul Newman, America's relationship to Israel appears not merely special, it looks a lot more like love. Thank you.
Questions and answers?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
But, and also Amy's going to do an initial response, and then we'll open the floor.
Okay. So, Amy, would you go first? Yeah.
Well, that gave me so much to think about, but I only have two things to say. And the first is, I wish I could do one more revision after listening to it, despite what John said, because of what John said, but because I've learned so much from all of your comments and serious and thoughtful engagement, and I know the book would be a better book if I could answer all your questions and take into account everything that you said, but alas, I can't, right? At a certain point, books just have to go off into the world and have their own life. And and I really can't imagine a better way for a book to launch itself in the world than this reception that it's had here. So the second thing I have to say is thank you. That is, thank you for taking the time to read and engage, and thank you for coming, many of you, very far. That is far both geographically and in disciplinary terms as well. So I really, really appreciate everything you've all done. And I want to give special thanks to Melanie for thinking of this idea, and for Jed Esty, chair of the English department, and the executive committee of the department for organizing this and making it happen. So thank you.
So, folks, it's open for questions and comments and so forth.
And you guys can also address each other if you obviously.
There's a question over there, Bob.
Please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And despite my T-shirt, which cost me $90 in joining our local Black radio organization. I am a member of the local chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, and I was very grateful for the shout out. And every time, and yes, we'll get your book and read it and learn what should have been in the initial accounts of deadly exchange. Thank you for bringing that up. And it's a big question, but I guess what I'm hoping to learn from the book is how to use this deeper understanding of the entanglement to disentangle and create some kind of justice for Palestinians. And I would be very happy for anybody to tell me which chapter will go.
You have to read it all.
Yeah, I might take the book.
Does anyone take this question?
I tried to say that the chapter on Lebanon War shows what happens when grossly contradictory images of Israel confront the Americans that have positioned themselves in the mainstream of the popular culture that Amy traces. Some of those, she talks about John Chancellor and others, twist themselves into pretzels in order to see the Israel that they always thought existed. But yet there are windows in that analysis where you see the potential for actual change. And I adverted to the implications of an unprecedented kind of polarization that exists in the United States, following on things that Shira said of the bottom falling out of liberal Zionism, which is another way of saying, because it's not falling out of the bottom of liberalism in the United States. And that opens up real intersectional and other opportunities for alliances and for appeals to elements in popular culture which are not those that have dominated so far. So that's one chapter I definitely recommend.
Can I just?
Please.
So, there are things about this in every point in the book. I agree that you'll enjoy reading all of it. But there's a moment that I noticed in the Exodus chapter that I think is also telling, because it talks about a television news show called Egypt, Israel, that came out in the context of I think it's the 50s, and it shows the television news show, which had Edward Murrow, right? Yeah, shows both the Palestinian and Israeli perspectives. You know, it's one of those moments where you think, oh, the facts are out here now, and it's coming on TV, and they're going to show, like, Palestinians are people, and the Palestinians in this situation, they're in Gaza, and they're pointing over where they can say, that was where my father's family's farm was. That's where we grew lemons. That's where this happened. And it's so vividly described, and therefore vivid. But then the news show ends by going up with an Israeli soldier in the watchtower, looking over the kibbutz where he's guarding, and she beautifully describes how you can tell all these facts, but when you end with him talking about, I just want to be a farmer, and it's in the dark, and the affect is with him. The facts are all over the thing, but in the end, they end with this affect with him as the person whose life and feelings count. And I think that sense of, when I was a political organizer, we kept thinking if we just told people enough facts, they would, it would work. And this is the 80s, so we'd have these like posters with tiny little type with all the facts that you might need to know. And there's a reason I went to grad school and became a cultural historian, because the facts weren't doing it. So I think that there has to be something about sentimental education that we see and try to unpack.
Severe.
This is a response to Rebecca's sense that there is a visible gap between Paul Newman and Ari Ben-Kanan. But in large parts of the world, and I include myself in that great unwashed mass, there was no gap.
Yeah, right.
You know, so the work that Exodus did,
Yeah.
certainly the novel and the movie, is one where we weren't in to the difference between an Ashkenazi
Sure.
European Jew and a North American Hollywood icon to know the difference. And I mention that only because the implications of this book and the scope of the book, rightly, has been my American Israel. But the consequences of this kind of discussion really have to be measured on a world scale.
Yeah.
Because in the last few years at least, there has been such a resurgence of right-wing governments, populist governments, and this is Professor Lustig's is an extension of his idea, across the world. And it's astonishing how many of them derive special sustenance now, both from Israel, but from a conception of an Israel backed by American global hegemony.
I would just add that, Suvir, on that point, that I think what's powerful about this book, and Amy's point, is that she's interested in its circulatory logic within American publics. But of course, this film has its multiple social lives, depending on where it went. And as someone who's interested in Israeli popular culture, I was fascinated by details I didn't know about its own social life within Israel. So of course, Israelis could recognize the difference. But for them, the power lay in the way it mobilized, through sentimentality, through this love story, right? But I think that's a great point.
Martha Hose, NYU. This actually follows on the last two questions. I'd love to hear the panel reflect on this book, the work this book could do in Israel for Israelis.
If it's not banned from importation.
Or if it got into the hands of Israelis, if it, assuming it could do that, what might that look like? I know there's a spectrum.
There's an archetype, it might even be in Exodus, I'm not sure, or maybe I'm thinking it's in the source, in Mitchell as a source, of the Israelis changing the signs on the Jewish National Fund forest to match whoever happens to be visiting at the time. So one trope is this, that would be immediately recognized is, oh yeah, well, let the Goyim think the way they do, because it's great for us. So then I'm not sure it would have that big a shock value. There's another trope in the book that's very familiar to Israelis, and that is called shoot and cry. So in that way, that is, you're moral or validated because although you shoot, you cry afterwards, or you cry about the fact that you had to shoot. And there's a lot in the book that goes right along with the shoot and cry ethos. And I think the book would probably encourage more reflection on that, which the left, what's left of it in Israel, does reflect on very, very directly. There is the kind of polarization we have in the United States is the same and different as it is in Israel. It's the same, and that's how deep it is. But in Israel, the problem is that the right is so much bigger than the left, that here is a little more equal.
Back, please.
Hi. I don't have the advantage of having read the book, so forgive me if this is covered, but if I'm hearing across your comments correctly, it seems like the main cross-racial, if that's a fair term, relationships categorized in the book are white and Jewish. I'm wondering if you have any sense yourselves or in the book of what other racial comparisons might have to do with the impact or utility of Zionism. The example that I'm really trying to think through with the help of this book's intervention is the deployment of military tactics and techniques of containment practiced in Israel used against Black Lives Matter protesters in the recent context here, though there are many other examples I'm sure we could populate with.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up in the last, not the conclusion, but the last chapter where she's talking about these exchanges between law enforcement agencies. I don't know if you want to add to it, but I think that's sort of the question that I have. That was sort of part of the question that I was trying to open up to the group, is sort of, is there going to be more space? Now, if in fact I'm correct, it's not just my analysis, but if in fact my proposition is correct that the liberal Zionist equation is becoming harder and harder to sustain, is the room opening up for more, for example, alliances between Palestinians and Black activists in the United States and their allies? I mean, other people in the room might have more to say about that, but I think that was the sort of the question. That was part of what was fueling my question.
And the early chapter makes the important point that the first critique of the kind of Exodus story as the real story is coming out of the African American internationalist left in the 1960s, though not solely there, right? So that was actually another one of those surprisingly shocking things when those arguments are not yet so heavily anchored that people can see, wait a minute, this looks like empire building, this looks like imperialism, etc. That was being articulated, but most importantly by Black thinkers in the early days.
In fact, it's in the chapter where Amy talks about it's 1967, the 1967
Right.
war,
Mhm.
and the way SNCC and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee take a position on colonialism in the Third World, which is in favor of Palestine and critical of Israel. So there's a bit of the history that actually speaks to some of what you're talking about as well.
And I just want to add, I have a student now who's actually working on the relationship between Puerto Rican nationalists and how they viewed Palestine in the 60s and 70s. And so she's looking at how, like, local groups in Chicago articulated a sense that the Puerto Rican Nationalist Project was linked to Palestine. And that's a pretty left portion of the Puerto Rican movement, but there's real sense that there were Arab American activists and Puerto Rican activists who were together constructing this kind of anti-colonial logic in the same period.
It strikes me, hi, thanks everyone. It strikes me that the shoot and cry kind of discourse and practice complicates Melanie to call for supplementing facts with sentiment, right? So I'm not my friend to come up with the political strategy that's going to resolve that euphoria, but I wonder if you could dig deeper into that complexity.
Well, let me just add that there's one of the histories that runs alongside this is, of course, the history of, I mean, what makes Exodus powerful, I think, exegetically, is also that this is a moment in the 50s and the early 60s, before the 1967 victory and the euphoria that follows, right? When there's still there's a sense of contradiction. American Jews have not yet consolidated around this alliance, right? In a way, one can tell the same story about Israel, that it's around 67 that shooting and crying comes. In the 50s, we see more sense of contradiction. Shooting and crying, in a sense, is over in the Israeli narrative, right? That's a product of a very particular moment of a liberal Zionist narrative, and now there's shooting and there's crying, but they're not conjoined. I would say, at least not in the same narrative. So, so there's a history of the American consolidation. Of the Israeli consolidation of its own sense of what militarism, of the normalization of militarism that runs alongside this book, which has, in a way, some similar vicissitudes.
The real crucial question, though, would be if that's happened in the United States also. Because if it hasn't, Amy's book says, well, Americans always fall back on an image of Israelis as okay, no matter what they did, because they shoot and cry. If America has changed so that we're only shooting and not crying anymore, then it doesn't matter. But if a good section of America still values that kind of angst associated with evil, then there are political opportunities. So you really have to make an analysis of.
I think it is. I mean, I think that the cry of anti-Semitism as in reply to any criticism of Israel and the sort of complaint that it's anti-Semitism that's the real problem in the world and nothing else. It's certainly rampant here and all over Europe as well. So I do think that it's not shoot and cry, but it's certainly support of the anti-terrorist politics of the justification of Israeli shooting as anti-terrorist in the name and crying anti-Semitism continues to exist in a very powerful way.
I think that the use of the anti-Semitism trope as a way to silence any contrary discourse on Palestine is a sign of absolute desperation. And that's the last weapon in the arsenal. And when you use that and it doesn't work, if it doesn't work, I mean, it may work, but if it doesn't work, it works in some European countries up to a point. If it doesn't work, then what's left?
But I
I
think
just
there's,
want,
go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think on that note, I think there's a generational split that's going on, and I think one of your research assistants, Aaron Steinberg Maddow, is that his name? I think he's really involved, or was really involved in Open Hillel,
Yeah.
and there's this growing group of college-educated young American Jews who since maybe 2008, 2012, especially since 2014, are saying enough is enough, we don't want to be continually lied to. We refuse to be represented by these mainstream Jewish establishment institutions like the Federation, which we now know in San Francisco and Los Angeles has been involved in Canary Mission. And there's a growing kind of unraveling of the Jewish community in this country that I think will lead to a rejection of this constant, but what about the Holocaust? What about
Well,
the
but
Holocaust?
that's offset by state legislatures that are
Yes.
Yeah,
passing
sure.
laws that say if you've supported BDS, you can't come to
Yeah.
you can't
I mean,
come to university campuses.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a powerful political backlash happening
course.
sort of parallel to what you're describing.
And I mean, there's a generational divide. You're absolutely right. We must never forget that all of the legislators that Joan's talking about, and all the people who actually have the portfolios and the bank accounts, and are the big donors to the political party, are old.
Yes.
And as far as they're concerned, every single thing in this book resonates with them. They're the people who shook their heads at the Institute
Yeah.
when Amy was giving her
Sure.
talk. Because these people believe the book Exodus as if it was
Yes.
the Bible.
Yes.
They drank it in with their mother's
Even if
milk,
they're
as it
secular
were.
Jews.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say, though, about, in answer to the first question about what might change things, and it'll only change things with the younger generation, and it'll take time.
Yeah.
It's something that I've thought for a very long time. All of the words, you were talking about the words, all of the words don't mean anything compared to the kind of effective and sentimental stuff based on images that the movie in particular, Exodus, represented. And I've always thought if only there were some filmic vision which didn't just throw facts at people, but which showed other sides of this issue than the one that's been hammered into us by 1,000 horrible TV shows and 57 lousy movies, then there would be progress. And there are beginning to be amazingly good movies, Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, and other, American. Unfortunately, as of this stage, they're not hitting the kind of Otto Preminger, 3 Oscars level of Exodus. But the movies that are coming out have an enormous, powerful, emotional impact. The movie Wajid by Anne-Marie Jessup, which has nothing to do with politics ostensibly, just now in the festival circuit, showing in New York. What it says about Israel and how Israel relates to Palestinians in passing is just devastating politically. And there are 15 wonderful films of that sort.
Right.
Can I also just, I want to say, I didn't mean to suggest the answer is any sentiment at all, right?
No,
And then what
agree
you
with
just
you.
said is, no, he was asking me, like, sentiment isn't the answer, no, but thinking of sentiment as one of the things that has to be responded to and addressed as opposed to just facts seems to me to be the important thing. And that's, I think, what you were saying, too, about the finding films that tell a different kind of a story. I just want to mention that there is, in an unexpected corner, and I mostly am completely hopeless about all of this, so I just try occasionally to find some moments. There is a crazy thing that's been going on in Bethlehem for the last 6 years, too, every other year.
Real
which is-
Bethlehem, not
Yeah,
Pennsylvania.
that real one. Which is a group of evangelicals from around the world meet at a conference organized by partly Bethlehem Bible College and partly by a bunch of leftists here in the U.S., leftist evangelicals, there are a few, and they have a conference called Christ at the Checkpoint, which is an unimaginable, like that's a kind of, yeah, right. It's funny, but it's also very powerful for people from a certain religious perspective, like, thinking Christ at the checkpoint, that's a meaningful phrase. Like, you get it really quickly. What happens if that Palestinian from 2,000 years ago or so is talked about as in relationship to current Palestinians? And it's had some impact.
I want to draw attention to one more crack on the American Jewish side that's in the book, and that it has to do with the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the conflict from the beginning over what its purpose was. That Amy highlights. I recently published something through the museum which was virulently attacked by the usual circles, and it was brought down from the site and then a year later put back up. And what I found was that ongoing struggle inside of the Holocaust Museum over whether the Holocaust is unique and you can only invoke it or talk about it in relation to Jews, or if the mission of the Holocaust Museum is one of an objective moral mission to prevent this kind of thing from happening anywhere, that is, you're interested in atrocities and genocide. This is an ongoing struggle inside the Holocaust Museum, and it is another, and it represents a crack, because it represents ways that other conceptions of things that are part of the narrative, other conceptions of the Holocaust, the meaning of the Holocaust, can enter into the thinking at a popular level as well as an intellectual level.
I wanted to add something to Rashid's question about cinema. And in reading this book, I was thinking about the cinematic nature of Zionism and wondering, is there something particular about the visual economy of Zionism in this period which gave it its spectacularity and produced that sentimental reach, that structure of feeling? I think the analog archive is shot by smartphones right now, right? So that's the sort of, the perceived promise of a counter-visual regime right now is in smartphone footage, and this is where the Palestinian project, resistance project, meets up with the Black Lives Matter project. A lot we can say about the investment in that visual regime, which is something I'm thinking about right now a lot, and the lament that follows, a familiar lament, when it fails to produce the effects that it wants. And this is a lament we see everywhere where smartphones are proliferating in sites of violence. So I think we have to be careful about investing, although I do think there's something about cinematic Zionism we have to take seriously. Note that Zionism and the film emerged concurrently historically. There's a lot there. But we want to be careful about investing too much in a counter-visuality, which might produce a different kind of sentimental attachment.
Others?
Maybe the time has come.
Then please join me in thanking the panelists and the author.